president of Finland asked me why am I wearing my name tag, and I said they won't let me in otherwise. We are a country of rules. Um, I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation, the Author's Corner. It's actually something we hosted in our first Raisina, when we actually had Prime Minister Harper discuss his book at that time, and subsequently we've had Dr. Jaishankar discuss two of his books at Raisina with our young fellows and alumni. And I'm delighted that for the first time on the main stage at Raisina, we have the opportunity of a visiting head of state, head of government, produce a book. The challenge is not too many of them write books. So thank you, President Stubb.
At least by themselves.
By themselves, at least by themselves. That's right. So for us, this is an ideal opportunity as a think tank to engage on a subject of content with a political leader of your stature. So President Stubb, thank you so much. And by the way, I must tell you, early feedback, you rocked. Your speech was fantastic and great feedback. So please join me in applauding him for his wonderful address last evening. So as we begin, I thought maybe, President, with your permission, we could ask you in 5 minutes or so to lay out the thesis of your book, and then maybe we could go to the rest of the discussants and maybe ask them to join in the discussions.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. I'll try to be even briefer than 5 minutes. So basically, the book, as you'll know, is called The Triangle of Power: Rebalancing the New World Order. I wrote it when I was in academia, and I was trying to get a framework for what I felt was going on in the world after Russia's attack on Ukraine. And the book is in 3 parts. The first part is about order and how order changes. The basic argument being we went from a bipolar Cold War to a unipolar US-led world in 1989, 1991, to now a multipolar disorder. My second argument, the second part of the book, is about the balance of the world, where I make an argument that we can frame the world into a triangle of power: the global West, the global East, and the global South. Now, if I were to rewrite this book, I might start calling it the rectangle of power, but that's besides the point. The reason is that for me, the global West, at least when I wrote the book, and I do make a preface here, was led by the United States. And the basic idea was that this group wanted to preserve the existing liberal world order as it was created some 80 years ago. And the opposite to this was the global East, led by China, followed by Russia, with the idea that they wanted to create a more multipolar world order. And for me, the thesis of the whole book is that it's actually the global South, led by the likes of India, that are going to decide the direction in which the world order is going to tilt. So first part is order, second part is balance, and the third part of the book is about the dynamics of the world order. And there, again, to be faithful to the threes, I say that we live in a world of competition, where you have geopolitical competition, technological competition, and many other forms of competition. And if we don't contain that competition of states, it will spill over into conflicts. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. After the end of the Cold War, we had a lot of local conflicts. They have now spilled over into regional conflicts: Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Palestine, or Iran, and the situation in the Middle East, or indeed the conflicts in Africa. So therefore, we need the third thing, which is cooperation. And then we come to the whole crux of the argument, is that you have a fairly binary choice in the conclusion between a multilateral world order and a multipolar world order. For me, multipolarity means obviously centrality of nation states. It means deals, transactions, spheres of interests, regionally or otherwise. And then finally, the potential of conflict, because there is little respect for rules, norms, and order. Multilateralism for me means international institutions, it means norms and rules and cooperation. And obviously, as someone who strongly advocates and supports a multilateral liberal world order, my suggestion pragmatically is to say that in order for that to happen, and in order for the global south to take the lead, we need to change the power structure of those institutions, in the sense that the institutions need to reflect the demography, economy, and power of 2026 rather than 1945. That's basically the thesis of the book. I have a few scenarios at the end as well. I tried to make it into an interesting read. So every chapter starts with an anecdote. Actually, I think the first one is of me texting to Sergei Lavrov as a humble professor from Florence that, please stop this war. You're the only one who can convince him. He sends me back a text saying, who do you mean, Biden or Zelensky? And then I end, I think, the book with a little anecdote of how 3 years later I'm standing on the first tee in Florida with President Trump discussing the war in Ukraine, and how life can take rather surreal twists and turns at times. So this is a book in a nutshell, and thanks for asking me to summarize it in 5 minutes. I think I succeeded.
But you did a fantastic job. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Two fun ones and two serious ones. I'm breaking with the three here. The fun ones. There's something about the sauna, right? And that's also. And for you, that seems to be, why does it seem to be the answer to every global governance challenge?
It is, and traditionally in Finland, the sauna meant that you took like your Soviet counterparts into the sauna, drank a lot of vodka, and didn't let them out until they agreed to your position. But nowadays, I think for me, it's a little bit more, Zen, in the sense that
it's more like yoga in India, pranayama.
It's right? A little bit like yoga. So I think we have 2.2 million saunas in Finland for 5.6 million people. So. So, that's why I sort of encourage everyone.
I mean, that's a deficit we have to work on, okay?
Yeah, it is. I mean, Finns are quite cool. As I said in my speech, we're quite sort of calm about stuff. And I think the sauna is a big part of our identity. And then if you have a chance to do an ice bath afterwards, that'll keep you healthy.
And the second fun question is 7 hours with Donald Trump. How did you survive that?
Well, I mean, so we had breakfast, a golf round, and lunch, and as I always say, human beings are very different in private from what they are in public, and it wasn't only a question of survival. I think it was a very enjoyable time. I come from a small country. It is very rare that the president of Finland has the time to spend 7 hours with the president of the United States in a social setting. And the fact that the social setting was golf, which we both share. I mean, I hadn't really played for many, many years, but I really, really enjoyed it. And we had fun. We were able to talk a little bit of shop, but in 7 hours, you talk about other things. So it was a good round. The effect of it diplomatically, I'm not going to comment on, but my wife is a little bit worried because I got all excited about golf again, and now I don't spend enough time at home.
Who won?
President Trump. Oh, but hey, we were on the same team. So because I was really worried in the beginning because it was Gary Player and Lindsey Graham. And first Trump said, because obviously he always wants to win, he says, I'm playing with Gary Player. And I was like, oh no. And then suddenly an advisor came and said, no, Mr. President, this is a team tournament. You're on the same team. I was like, whew. That would have ditched Finnish foreign policy right there.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, now the two serious questions. I always have a little bit of a problem with that formula. And by the way, I've read your book in its various stages of production. I always have a problem with dismissing multipolarity as being somehow disorderly, chauvinistic, patriarchal world. I believe multipolarity and multilateralism can work together. In fact, the multilateralism is the problem here, not multipolarity. And I think that's one problem I have with the book. And the second issue is obviously that we have to give the Global South agency. I don't think Global South is waiting for anyone to give agency. I think it is happening de jure. And as they progress, as they emerge, they are going to occupy spaces. Is your attempt to suggest that we should do it in a partnership model so that Global West doesn't find itself at the wrong end of the bargain?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you two very realistic answers. I mean, as a former civil servant, I remember writing memos for politicians where you first presented one extreme, let's say multipolarity, then you presented another extreme, let's say multilateralism, and you knew that at the end of the day, you were going to land somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. So I'm quite realistic that the world is probably going to be some kind of a combo of multipolarity and multilateralism. Coming from a small state, I just happen to prefer multilateralism, certainly because it protects me and it gives me more agency. And of course, the example that I have for this is the one where we have gone sort of the furthest with multilateralism, which is the European Union, where we have pooled sovereignty on issues which have to do with the fundamental tenets of nationhood, mm-hmm. like currency, monetary policy, trade, customs, competition. These were things that you decided yourself, but at the end of the day, we decided it's better to do this alone. So I fully understand that is not the level of multipolarity that we're going to get in the United Nations. So that's my first realistic take. It's probably going to be a combo of multipolarity and multilateralism, but I didn't want to start inventing some kind of a new term because sometimes they end up being a little bit corny. Then secondly, yes, I'm completely realistic. I'm not asking for you to wait to take agency. You take as much agency as you want, but I'm realistic that you're going to do it. And therefore, I suggest to my Western partners that, listen, guys, if the world is going to change, if the Global South is going to decide, play ball. You know, stop taking the moral high ground. Stop being the teacher and the preacher. Be the partner and the cooperative. And that's why I think it was great that the European Union just did a free trade agreement with India. That's the kind of values-based realism I'm talking about.
But you did it first. I think Finland and Switzerland and a couple of others did the agreement with India. No, not Finland. That was Norway. That was Norway. Sorry, that was the better Nordic country.
Those are the guys that are outside the EU.
Smarter Nordic country, Norway. Okay.
Richer Nordic.
I am going to now go back to the threes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the three discussants here to think of three things they concur with, or three things that they found striking and they kind of want to discuss from the book. Perhaps also could be some critique or could be
no.
also a pushback, right? So Wali, can I start with you? And then I'll come down to Dr. Jaishankar. Wali, let me start with you.
I hope my advisors are taking note because I don't have pen and paper here.
So thank you very much, and I actually very much enjoyed the book, and I think these arguments are very timely. It's a very excellent start of the conversation, particularly in the Global South, in terms of where they are going. But I want to sort of take off from the book, if I may, rather than reiterate points in it, which is we're reading this book at a very particular time as well. And of course, as any author, once you finish with writing the book, obviously events can come forward. And what I would see perhaps is that in the breakdown of the old order, which you outlined very clearly, what we're seeing actually is a huge push by the country where I live in, the United States, to actually create a unipolar world against and in defiance of multilateralism, whereas the last time we had a unipolar United States. It worked through multilateral institutions. It helped support them. But actually right now, in this instance, is a great deal of effort to create a unipolar world in defiance and in rejection of multilateralism. And I would say that perhaps the conversation that the president starts if we're going to go to the next step is in terms of how do we deal with both the costs of the United States attempt to create a multipolar world, and also how does it actually flow within the Global South. I mean, when you look at Latin America and Middle East today, I think these conflicts are happening as a consequence of the exercise of unipolarity. Whatever the underlying reasons for it might be, but the way they are unfolding is really at the cost of multipolarity. So we can have all this conversation about the broader issues like trade, etc. But the most urgent issues facing the world and the global South is how to deal with the cost of this enormous push for unipolarity. And I would read the president's book actually as a starting point for how do we actually manage this and how we do respond to it. You know, the book is not in a vacuum. The book should be read in the context of what is happening.
Can I collect the questions first, President? Yeah, okay. So, Vipke, let me turn to you.
Thank you so much, Samir. Thank you so much, Alex, for also outlining your book here. You asked about things with the three, and I learned from Alex that it's really important always to put a three there.
Yeah.
So let me stress one point that I think is really important that we will need to discuss more, and this has to do something with age. I'm turning 30 in a few days, so there's my big three. But I think that what we need to remember is what unifies the world is that the younger people grow up in a different world than 20 years before. So when I wake up, the first thing I do, I admit, I go on Instagram, I scroll, and when I try to prepare for a speech like this or for a panel like that, of course, I first look on Instagram, what kind of reels did you post? What kind of interviews did you give? And I think what we need to remember is that the world changes rapidly because we have social media. We do have Google, we have YouTube, we have Instagram, we have TikTok, we have Facebook. And these are such new powers that we also need to keep in mind because it unifies the younger world because 3 points, we are even more connected. The world is even more rapid because you can get news instantly. And the third point is that we are also more polarized. And this is something that worries me because I see that you can't really talk about, okay, maybe you have a point, but I still disagree with some other points with you. And that I think is really dangerous for the world and can create a whole new world as well when we don't think of it. Because I think the youth with this new connectedness can play a huge role, but it can also be a great danger if we don't consider it well enough that this also might change foreign policy.
I think that's a very interesting point. Are we visualizing a future from the mindset that belonged to the last century? And in some sense, the terms, the grammar, the vocabulary actually belongs to the past. And is that perhaps a fundamental flaw in trying to visualize what may work in the future? But Vipke, let me ask you a question since you have scrolled his Instagram handle. How's his game? How's his Insta game?
It's almost as good as the Insta game of Narendra Modi.
Okay, almost as good. Wonderful. Okay, Dr. Jaishankar, the threes to you. I think that's your mic. No, where is it? Yeah, you can go ahead.
This is mine.
Yeah, that's yours.
Well, let me also go with the threes, and I'll go exactly the way President Stubb said, the past, the present, and the future. So, order to disorder. So let's be honest. Whose order was it? Okay. This was the order by the West, for the West, from the West. Now, it doesn't mean that others didn't use it. Smart people did, smart countries did. But when we look back at these 70 years, I think the expectation that we can freeze a 1945 or a 1989 forever was a very unrealistic one. In fact, look back at these 70 years. Okay, these 70 years we debate, how did we do? Why didn't it last? 70 years is 1% of Indian history. Why would 1%
of Indian history bother you?
last? No, it bothers me. But why would it last? Life moves on. So somewhere I think this attachment to the past did not take into account the forces that were propelling the change. So then we come to the present. The 2-3 points I really liked about the book. One, of course, the fact that it was a triangulation. because much of the debate today is global West, the fight within the West, to some extent a binary of West and East. So I really appreciate that you brought in the South, because conceptually the South matters more and more. Also, I think one important variable which often gets left out, which is demographics. That, if there are going to be two big changes in this decade, one will be technology, but the other will be demography. And, I think President has kind of brought that into the metrics. Regarding the future, it's, again, a lot of the analysis is obviously centered around the changes in America. So is the book. So it's about G1, it's about G2, though that's not that strongly addressed by you. I understand why, I empathize fully with that. You've even in passing referred to a kind of G3. The three being Russia. And my sense is you're going to have a future which will really be much more multipolar, because no country today has hegemony over so many domains that it is an overall hegemon. So there is it's not just a distribution of GDP and capabilities. I think in different domains, different parts of the world will be more contributive or will have more capability. So the power in its different dimensions is spread out much more. So to that extent, your point that, we can't really use completely the tools and experiences of the past to project ahead.
So, President, you have some feedback from three of them. I particularly like the idea that how does this arrangement play out in the peace and security domain that we are currently challenged by? Do young people and the demographic change that we are experiencing relate, incorporated in this?
No, I mean, really, I think good constructive criticism. I see the whole conceptualization of the book as an iteration, and therefore, just like Vali said, kind of a beginning of a conversation. I personally then try nowadays as a policymaker to sort of push it a little bit forward. I did that in two of my UN speeches in September 24 and 25. I did it in a foreign affairs article, which I called The West's Last Chance. And I did it in my speech yesterday, where I tried to bring, I think, a practical element of a New Delhi moment. In other words, a getting together of world leaders to discuss what the next order looks like. So that's why this conversation is useful. First observation, I had not, Vali, thought about we having a new unipolar moment, but I think you're actually right. And I think Dr. Jaishankar, you also referred to that there is this element that, yes, there is multipolarity, but the United States is obviously doing many of the things without consultation. I mean, unlike it did in Libya, unlike it did in Iraq or in Afghanistan, where there was an attempt at least to, get the UN
consult
Security
at least
Council.
some countries.
Yes, some countries, and also, discuss in the UN. So then we come to what is the cost for peace and security. Well, we can see it right now. And this is what makes me so optimistic that we're going to have this new multilateral moment. And so I try to see the silver lining and say, well, because we're seeing what's going on in the Middle East, we're seeing what's going on in Ukraine, we're seeing what's going on in Sudan, therefore we need to come together to some kind of a new covenant, because actually the cost of multipolarity is too high right now. And I fully understand, Samir. I am simplifying the fact and making multipolarity look a baddie, whereas in some minds, actually multipolarity is getting agency from a multilateral world which didn't give them agency. But I do think this is a starting point, and I do try to put it in the context what happens. And this is kind of a double answer to Vali and Dr. Jaishankar. I mean, the reason I joked in the beginning that should I call this the rectangle of power instead. So now if I would frame it again, I would think hard again that, you know, are we in one of those moments where there is a detachment of the United States from the global West? And I think the jury is still out, but there's an element of that. And interestingly enough, it's the global West that's really upset about it, that, ooh, what's going on? Whereas, you know, countries in the Gulf region and elsewhere are kind of saying, listen, you're getting the medicine that we've been getting for the past 80 years, so get used to it. So then my argument would be just based on the US national security strategy, where the number one region is the Western Hemisphere. So then the US becomes the global West with its own line.
By the way, I asked the Deputy Secretary from the US yesterday, what does American Western Hemisphere foreign policy means? And he brought it all the way to India. So Western Hemisphere is also growing.
Then it's quite big. But then, you know, then I would use the global North as the new sort of ideological global West. But then that's a problem because I come from the global North and it sounds a bit sort of, I don't know, too mirroring. Yeah. Then to Vinke, I fully agree. You know, it's an issue of age. It's an issue of social media. I mean, you know, people make the question, are we cyborgs? My question now is, what is the first thing you do in the morning when you wake up? You probably look at your phone, right? You check at all your basic metrics of how you slept and the media, etc.
You know, the best way to reconcile that problem is by making the phone wake you up.
It's true. But the bottom line is that I do think that we're completely attached. And one of the things, the original version of the book was actually called Digital Democracy or Digital Dictatorship. But then I decided to convert it into more of a geopolitical book. But I do think that one of the most sort of underestimated elements of geopolitics is technology. There are many good books about it, you know, right now. There's one by Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger, and there are many others as well that we should look into it. And I do agree that we might have a slightly old mindset about the way in which we try to use the new tools in the world. But that's why I'm saying this is not 1945. This is 2026, and we need to have a revision of it. And then to Dr. Jaishankar, I mean, if I read you correctly, you're not a big fan of the way in which I treated the past, but you're okay with the way in which I look at the present, and you're fairly happy at how I look at the future, right? And so this is good news for me. It's good news for Finnish-India relations. But what I do in the book in the beginning, I sort of try to undress the pretext that this book is somehow a neutral assessment of the world. I tell about my own identity. I am born in Finland. I'm a Nordic, I'm a European, and I have gotten my grounding for academia and my intellectual path in the United States. So I'm by definition a child of the end of the Cold War. I belong to the end of history category of humans who look at the world from a very Western perspective. And I've gotten pushback on this from other friends as well, that why don't you deal with, say, colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. And I even get pushback from my team who said, we don't like your dates because they're too Western oriented. So I take that, but I wanted to, you know, put out there in the front that I am a prisoner of my own identity. And that's why you can see the sort of past thinking of that. 70 years is 1% of Indian history. But for me, I'm now a country that is 110 years old, because we gained independence in 1917. So again, that's why my sort of thinking is a little bit limited, and to a certain extent, from an understandable perspective, historical. And it is by the West, for the West, and from the West. I like the way in which you framed it. Then on the present thing, I'm glad that you like the triangle of power and the fact that this is not a binary assessment of East versus West. That is, I think, the big idea of the book. And now I just hope that people who are more acquainted with things linked to the global south are able to develop the ideas that come out there. And I do think in quite a good way I push the demography argument and the tech argument there. Although the tech argument, I admit, is a little bit too Chinese in it, whereas it should have been, I think, a little bit more Indian as well. On the future, I really don't know. I think that's where we are. I mean, I come back to my speech yesterday. We over-rationalize the past, we over-dramatize the present, and we underestimate the future. And I think this is what the book sort of just throws some ideas out there that I hope that people grab onto.
Dr. Jaishankar, I could see you wanting to
No, I just had one brief comment, which is to pick up, Samir, on your point. Multipolarity is here to stay. Okay. What we will have, which we are already seeing, is to some extent, some of the bigger countries will make temporary compacts on limited issues. I'm not saying they are insincere about it, maybe they are, but structurally, there's not going to be some big deal between powers and the rest of the world has to put up with it. That era is over. So the one thought I would suggest is, if multipolarity is there to stay, the issue is not that it's against multilateralism. You can have multipolarity with multilateralism and multipolarity without multilateralism, or how much multilateralism. So the success of multilateralism should not depend on the weakening of multipolarity, because the weakening of multipolarity is not going to happen. So I would sort of just urge you to reflect on that.
Quick response, President?
Yeah, quick response. I agree, and that's why I think in chapter 3, where I talk about the evolution of international organizations and institutions, I raise modern forms of multipolarity, and I call them either holy or unholy alliances, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is not necessarily values-based, but it is interest-based. And I'm super happy a country like India is in there, from my perspective. I mentioned the BRICS as an example of multipolarity. Then on the more holy alliances, AUKUS is an example there of.
How is AUKUS holy and BRICS unholy? I didn't get that.
It's a little bit values and interest-based. I think BRICS is
Interest-based. I think it's interest-based.
yeah.
There's no values there.
in AUKUS.
Or in BRICS. I'm saying
No,
this
not
is
in BRICS.
interest-based, both of them.
But don't you think AUKUS is a little bit?
Well, what is the value here? It's white people ganging up and getting nuclear devices exchanged with each other. What's the value here? I mean, look, listen. I'm just being a little provocative.
I'll take it back. I mean, the Quad is more values and interest rate. No, but I mean, no, I agree. But it is countries that have similar values that get together on the basis of interests. Whereas in BRICS, it's not countries that have similar values. They get together on the basis of interest. And it's not. These are not, Samir. These are not value judgments. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but they're forms of multipolarity. So that's my first point. My second point is the reason in yesterday's speech I wanted to bring another element into it, and it was a thesis that I thought about long and hard in the book, but didn't make clearly enough. I think that regional integration, call it regional multilateralism, is actually the best breeding ground for global multilateralism. So if I had a choice, I'd start, instead of these slightly haphazard multipolar arrangements, I'd go for the regional thing and then bring
Bottoms
it up.
up.
Yeah, bottoms up. But it's complicated as well.
So I have one question before I go to our young fellows. It's a tradition here. We go to our young fellows and take questions from them. So before I go to them, I have one question for all of you. Since we have a fairly graphic estimation of the global West that you describe. I'm not sure we fully understand global South in the same frame. So in some sense, could I ask each of you what global South really means for you? And Vipke, I have one additional question for you. In your Instagram world, how many folks are interested in this conversation that we are having? In your Instagram world, how many of your followers are interested in this kind of a conversation? Just think about it, okay? So is this going to be trending on your timeline? That's my question for you. Wally, can I start with you? Global South, and what does it really mean for you and for those who you work with?
I mean, in a way, it's a residual concept. In other words, it's what the West is not, and often even the terminology, the way we think about it, often comes from the West. But although, just to Dr. Jaishankar's point, it does have a history. I mean, it goes back to the 1950s and era of decolonization, and the way in which these former colonies basically said we're neither the East nor the West, and we don't want to be limited to that struggle. Its self-conception has changed over time. But I think we still are dealing with some of that in a sense, that there's a vast region of the world that wants to be recognized, if you would, as equal partners in shaping the global order. It doesn't, where it's lacking, I think, is a clear sense of values because it's such a disparate region of the world. So yes, it has a common history or a common historical experience of colonization, imperialism, and not being taken seriously. But beyond that, I think it lacks a positive sense of what set of values does it want to bring to the table. So in a way, it's still captive to the set of values that international law that came out of World War II is still trying to establish.
Fair enough. Dipke?
So first of all, I'm not from the Global South. I need to stress that in the first point. I do understand why Alex made the point of putting three things there: Global West, Global East, and Global South. But at the same time, at least in my perception from the Global West, I feel like the Global South is much more diverse, and that it is probably also a little bit acquainted as a term, because I think that you can't really put several countries who are considered sometimes Global South into the same pot. For example, I'd love India to play a much bigger role also in G7, for example. I think that it would be really important to have such a big democracy in these global superpower rounds. I think this would be really helpful. So I think, I mean, I'm also here to listen and to learn. This is why I came to India, because I think this is such a fascinating country with such a bright future. And I think that the relations between Europe and India should be strengthened. That's also why I'm here, to listen and to learn. But this is my perception as of now. Please come to me and tell me what I got wrong. And for your second question, I'm sure that this discussion will be turned into great reels so that they are a little bit shorter for everyone to watch on the internet. But at the same time, I feel that the younger generation is really interested in politics.
It is.
Because for us, our future isn't certain anymore. We don't have the promise anymore that we might live a better life than our parents, at least not in Europe or in Germany. They are great questions to be asked from the youth. So they are really interested in what's going on in the world. And so I think this is a topic that we need to address more. But thank you very much also for getting me on this panel, because I always feel like the younger voice is often lacking in these conversations.
Okay. I can now turn to Dr. Jaishankar for his, probably the foreign minister from the Global South, to respond to what the Global South really means.
You know, look, I think the definition of Global South would be a solid, countries who had been colonized. But it's not so much a definition. I mean, in here if you are from the Global South or not. It's a emotion. It's a sense of solidarity. And don't take it as sloganeering or some kind of diplomatic clever term. Look, when COVID happened, the fact that a country like India, which was still undergoing its vaccination, was willing to send out vaccines to countries of the Global South means Global South is for real, because it meant something for us. So there is a emotion, and I would argue to some degree a culture where Global West is concerned. So Global South emanates from shared historical experiences. You could argue we are the victims in a sense of history, recent history, who have combined together. I think Global West was probably a more unified term, very cultural, very political, very strategic, till recently. Now there is a differentiation in the Global West, which is why he wants to make it a rectangle. The fact that it's still there, I would argue, but less cohesive, less tight than before. I have actually a question on the global East, because I don't think that kind of solidarity or that kind of cohesion really exists where Eastern
Hemisphere.
So, yeah, well, there's no Eastern Hemisphere in, I mean, this is meant.
Unless you're reading Kishore's book. So,
But I would argue that, many of the countries which are envisaged as global East really think of themselves much more as strong national players and much less collectively as an East. So I think it's less cohesive. West is more differentiated. I think South is very...
South is a vibe. You said South is a vibe.
Right.
South is a vibe. West is differentiated. East is probably the weakest.
Invented.
Is invented.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't go that far. But first of all, I'm not gonna, give advice sitting next to Dr. Jaishankar about what the global South is. But I really liked your definition that you feel it, you sense it, it's in your heart, it's about culture, it's about identity. I mean, it's obviously broader and different than a national identity, but there's a feeling and a sense, and some of it is definitely historical. And then the diversity within the global South, whether it's geography or politics or demography or economics, is huge, but that's why we are different. And here's where I want to come to, again, the iteration point on the book. Yesterday, my second point out of the three proposals was that respect diversity globally. And that needs to be seen in the institutions as well. I should tell you one interesting thing. I mean, I remember sending a message to a friend of mine, and I said that foreign policy should never be driven by the past, because then we victimize ourselves. And I was thinking about Russia, because Russia is super good at using the historical narrative. She came back to me and said, "How dare you say that? That means that you're erasing periods of colonial history and others." I said, "Whoops, point well taken. You're absolutely right." That's why it's so difficult to, for a Westerner to write about it. My sort of final point is on the social media and Modi. I was super happy that we were able to do a joint posting on Instagram with Modi. We have 4 million views of it.
Okay, so I'm Dr. Jaishankar. Before I open it up to the three junior fellows who are going to come and speak to us, he's been mentioning the New Delhi moment and Delhi calling everyone and having a conversation. Possible, impossible, real?
He thinks I'm underemployed. But it's an interesting thought. It's certainly an interesting thought.
Okay, I'm going to get my mics to the three fellows, the young fellows this year, Chawla, Huang, and Naomi. And we're going to take them together, and then we are going to, you can note down the questions, and we're then going to go to the final round. That's how we're going to end. So let's start with Chawla.
All right, thank you for the opportunity.
Chawla, quick introduction.
Okay, so my name is Chawla. I'm a lecturer at the University of Indonesia. So actually, part of my questions I've already answered about how do you define the global South? But then I don't think that, sorry, Mr. Minister, but then I don't think the emotion is enough to define the global South. So do we need another meeting like we have, like, for instance, in 1955, we have the Bandung Conference, which is initiated, for instance, by India and also Indonesia, to define that we are against the colonialism, we are against the neocolonialism, to show that there is a spirit of the so-called global South. So do you think that, maybe for all the speakers, do you think that we have to have such a meetings to define the identity of the so-called global South, global East, or like global West? Thank you.
So time for a Bandung 2.0. I think that's the question. Huang.
Right. Hi, thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone. This is Huang from the South China Sea Institute in the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. My questions is for, of course, President Stubb, but also Minister External Affairs, Jaishankar. The book talked about like the new world order. So I was just wondering, what is your assessment on the possibility of the so-called grand bargaining scenario within that new world order, especially after the fact that the Trump administration released a new national security strategy that refers to the so-called Donroe Doctrine that directly mention the need to avoid direct confrontations with China, and after the fact that China's sort of responses to Iran and Venezuela are sort of a little bit muted and restrained.
The grand bargain between the big two.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
And the final question by Naomi. Naomi?
I'm Noemi Palfavi. I'm from Hungary and I work at a think tank. And my question is related to international organization. It was partially answered by President Stubb, but I would like to ask the panel's view on where do you see the role of international organization in this new multilateral moment? And when it comes to regional cooperation, it was mentioned quite nicely that it's as a positive thing, but even within the European Union, we are having quite heavy debates about the future of the EU. And to President Stubb, how do you build back trust between society and the institutions themselves? Thank you.
So I think that's the three questions. President Stubb, why don't you start?
Okay, if I can deflect the first question, because it was about defining the global south to the global south, because the last thing you want is someone from the global west to the global north to tell about what your identity is. I mean, it's undignified foreign policy, which I speak vehemently against. So the second question coming from Vietnam, and I should say, you know, the book is being actually translated into Vietnamese. It's still pending authority approval, but so I'm really looking forward to that. Can there be a grand bargain? I believe there can be a grand bargain of a new world order, much like there could be one after World War II. That's why I think shift the balance, have that grand bargain, increasing the working hours of the Foreign Minister of India. So do it in a New Delhi moment. Now, is it going to be simple? No. But I would probably argue that US foreign policy right now, as defined in the national security strategy, where you have a mega strand, which is ideology, and where you have a pecking order, which is America first, number one, Western Hemisphere, number two, Indo-Pacific, number three, Europe, number four, Middle East, and number five, Africa, is precisely the reason we need it. The problem that I have is that we have now some countries, and most of them big, who believe that foreign policy is zero-sum. I actually believe that diplomacy is win-win. And win-win you get in the context of multilateral institutions, not in terms of bilateral deals. On international organizations, and the question from Hungary, I'll just tag on to the Europe thing. So first, there's one little thing I disagree with what Dr. Jaishankar said. I do see that there's a rift in the transatlantic partnership, but I have personally never seen the European Union more united than it is right now. And the reason for that is that there is security pressure coming from Russia, and then so the East, and then there's transitional pressure coming from the West, in other words, the United States. And this means that Europe is huddling up. Of course, you're going to have discrepant voices like Hungary at this particular moment, but unity is still there. And just my final point, I think we need to stop thinking about the European Union as some kind of utopia. It always advances in three phases. First, there is a crisis. Second, there is chaos. And third, there's a suboptimal solution.
Let me go to Wali. Wali, you want to come in on any of this? Dipke?
Just very shortly, I think I'd like to stress how lucky I am that I was born into the European Union. I was born in 1996, so I don't know the Iron Curtain from experience, but I know how lucky I am that I can travel from country to country, that I don't have to exchange any currency, that I know that I am safe and secure in a multilateralistic world as the European Union is. And I think that the European Union should be a model and should stay as it is, because it's such a great place. And I'm also very happy that we now got the new trade agreement between the EU and India, because this makes us such a powerful economic zone that we can all profit from. And I think that we should put that or take that into consideration and also stress what's good in the world at the moment, because we often analyze the problems that we're having. But let me do a shout out how grateful I am in the world that I'm living, and that I'm so grateful that there's now this great connection between India and the European Union.
Thank you, Dr. Jaishankar. Maybe your response, and also as we close, thank you to President Stubb for his visit, because this is going to be his last public appearance here.
Right. So the first question, no, I was not suggesting that emotion is the be-all, end-all of Global South. I said it's the basis for it. And in fact, I gave a practical example, which was the vaccine, distribution, the vaccine cooperation. There is, by the way, something called the Voice of Global South, which is a gathering which we do every year. We've done for the last 3 years. The analogy which you use now, going back to 1955, 1955 when people gathered, they tended to see the West as really the primary source of their challenges. I think that today would not be the assessment necessarily of the Global South. Global South faces challenges which are not necessarily from the West. There are other sources of problems too. So the world has changed. It's, I'm not saying ignore the past, on the contrary, but I do think today there is a new basis for a Global South platform. But the part of the underpinning of that platform is that sense of solidarity. On the, will there be a grand bargain? Look, grand bargains in today's very complex world will be very hard to sustain as a very broad bargain. You can have a specific bargain, I'll give you this if you give me that. Or let's agree for 1 year not to do this. There will be very specific meeting points and intersections. But that era where, big countries come and create spheres of influence and, reach huge compacts of a sweeping nature, I think are not there. And when I look today at the countries concerned, I don't think any of them have any intention of conceding anything to anybody else. So I think let's recognize the situation for what it is. There will be tactical steps. There will be limited moves, but I don't, grand bargain, by the word grand, means a long period and a big space, and I don't see that happening. The international organization, I think President Stubb has made a very powerful case for why they need to be reformed. And in fact, even the regional point which he made, it's there. I mean, I read it in the book. These organizations will be imperfect. There will always be need to improve them, to reform them. But at the end of the day, we are better off with them than without them. We have a lot of issues, say, with the United Nations. We are one of the strongest advocates of reform. But if you ask me, would you prefer a world without the UN? My answer is no. So the task is, to be able to differentiate between the baby and the bathwater and not, throw them both out. And I do feel that, whether it's regional efforts which will be building blocks to a global effort or the global organization itself, there is a lot of scope. I mean, I want to say to President Stubb and to all of you, India is a very firm believer in multilateralism. But we also know that multipolarity is a reality. And we are able to reconcile both of them, just as we are able to reconcile our national interests with our international obligations. So before I end, again, I want to thank President Stubb, because I think in all these years of Raisina, this is the first time that we've had an author's corner with a guest of honor. And
Author's corner with a guest of honor.
That is really
wonderful.
Something very special.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in applauding this wonderful panel and President Stubb. Can we?